Imagine stepping into a dimly lit tavern in 1905. The air is thick with the scent of smoked meats, aged ale, and something slowly simmering on the wood-fired stove. Laughter echoes off tin ceilings, boots thud against creaky floorboards, and tucked in the corner, a family of 5 savors a hot meal most of us have never even heard of. Welcome to Middletown, a forgotten crossroad in American history, where factory owners dined beside farmers, and where taverns weren't just for drinking, they were the heart of the community. These were the spots where middle-class families gathered after long days of honest labor, not for luxury, but for comfort and flavor. But behind those saloon doors were recipes, rich, rustic, and unapologetically hearty, that have vanished from our modern tables. Dishes born out of seasonal necessity, immigrant ingenuity, and a touch of tavern rebellion. Meals like beef and oyster pie, smothered rabbit, and buttermilk pie with nutmeg crust, each one a whisper from the past. Today, we're not just uncovering recipes, we're digging up the very soul of early 20th century America. These meals weren't made by celebrity chefs. They were crafted by resilient mothers, hard-working tavern cooks, and everyday people who knew how to turn modest ingredients into unforgettable feasts. So, grab a seat by the fire, pour yourself a glass of something old-fashioned, and get ready. Because what you're about to discover isn't just food. It's a taste of a forgotten America. Subscribe now, because the next dish we uncover might just be the one your great-grandparents swore by, and the world forgot. In the quiet taverns of 1900s Middletown, nestled between dusty roads and smoky chimneys, there was a dish that turned heads and warmed bellies. Smothered rabbit with onion gravy. Now, don't let the name fool you, this was no rugged hunter's feast. This was the pride of many middle-class taverns, served to families who sought something special after Sunday service or a week's labor at the local mill. Rabbit was not only affordable, it was accessible. Most families kept them in backyard hutches. And unlike beef or pork, which required more money or rationing, rabbit was tender, lean, and ready in less time. The process began with butchering the rabbit into joints, soaked in buttermilk to tenderize and remove gamey notes. The pieces were then dredged in seasoned flour and pan-fried in lard or bacon grease until golden brown. But here's where the magic really happened. The gravy. Sliced onions were slow-cooked in the same skillet, scraping up every bit of flavor left behind. A bit of flour was added, then water or weak broth, rarely milk, which was saved for the children. The result was a thick, rich, golden gravy, poured over the rabbit pieces, now nestled in a cast-iron pan. Covered and left to simmer for over an hour, the meat grew fork-tender, soaked in that sweet salty onion elixir. Served with cornbread or mashed potatoes, this was more than a meal, it was tavern comfort, built on tradition and necessity. But as times changed, so did tastes. Rabbit fell out of favor, replaced by store-bought chicken and pre-packaged convenience. Today, few remember how common it once was. Yet in that fading memory lies a dish worth reviving. Smothered rabbit with onion gravy isn't just forgotten, it's buried history on a plate. Stick around, because the next recipe might just rewrite what you thought you knew about America's culinary past. And if this stirred your curiosity, hit that subscribe button. There's more forgotten flavor just ahead. Before takeout menus and box dinners, there was a time when comfort came bubbling from a stovetop pot, and nothing brought the family together quite like a steaming bowl of chicken fricassee with dumplings. In early 1900s Middletown taverns, this dish wasn't reserved for holidays. It was a dependable midweek luxury for the medium-class family. Whether cooked in the tavern's back kitchen or in the home of a local schoolteacher, chicken fricassee was a celebration of what could be done with simple ingredients and a bit of patience. The chicken was often a tough old hen, past her laying years, slow-simmered to coax out tenderness. First browned in lard or butter, the pieces were then braised gently with chopped onions, carrots, and celery. But the secret lay in the roux, flour browned just enough to turn golden, then loosened with broth and a splash of milk or cream if it could be spared. This wasn't fast food, it was slow love. As the chicken simmered, soft dumplings were made. Not dropped like biscuit dough, but rolled from flour, salt, and lard, cut into ribbons or little pillows, then gently laid into the broth like sleepy clouds. They soaked up the gravy, thickened it further, and turned every bite into something rich and rib-sticking. Taverns served it piping hot in deep bowls, often with a ladleful of extra gravy poured on top. It wasn't flashy, but it was honest. A dish that filled the stomach and the soul. But as prepackaged food took over post-World War II kitchens, slow-cooked meals like this were left behind. The fricassee faded from memory, labeled too old-fashioned, too much work. Yet in that forgotten pot lies a story of resilience, care, and nourishment. Chicken fricassee with dumplings wasn't just food. It was family. It was survival. And it was absolutely delicious. If you've never tasted history like this, you're in for a journey. Subscribe now, because next, we're unearthing a tavern pie that once turned factory workers into loyal regulars. In the flickering gaslight of a Middletown tavern, where factory whistles marked time and hard-earned coins paid for warm meals, there was one dish that made jaws drop and regulars return: beef and oyster pie. Yes, beef and oysters. Today, it sounds unusual. But in early 1900s America, it was considered a match made in tavern heaven. Back then, oysters weren't a delicacy. They were cheap, abundant, and shipped inland by the barrel. Beef was hearty, grounding. Oysters brought brine and silkiness. Together, a working man's surf and turf, baked under a crust. This wasn't the food of the rich, but of the rising middle class. Factory foremen, shopkeepers, clerks, they craved nourishment and novelty. And beef and oyster pie offered both. Chunks of beef, often chuck or shin, were seared until deeply browned, then stewed low and slow with onions, celery, and a splash of ale. Near the end, fresh oysters were added, just long enough to cook but not lose their delicate texture. The result? A stew that was both robust and refined. All of it was tucked into a deep ceramic dish and covered with a flaky suet or butter crust. Once baked, the crust sealed in the steam and scent. When pierced at the table, the aroma would rise like a memory, salty, savory, bold. This dish told a story of American abundance, of British influence, and of taverns where no two pies tasted quite the same. But with time, oysters grew expensive. Beef got industrialized. And pies gave way to canned soups and frozen meals. The beef and oyster pie quietly disappeared from menus and from memory. Yet today, its flavor still lingers, in old cookbooks, tavern logs, and the few kitchens daring enough to bring it back. This isn't just a dish. It's a forgotten union of land and sea, of grit and grace. It was the kind of breakfast that could sober up a man after a long night at the tavern, or fuel a factory worker for a 12-hour shift. In the heart of Middletown around the 1900s, no dish was more bold, more unmistakably Southern, than ham and redeye gravy. Simple? Forgettable? Never. This was tavern food with a punch, served hot, salty, and steaming before most of the town even stirred. At first glance, it looked like just a slab of country ham with some dark sauce on the side. But behind that humble plate was a flavor combination unlike anything else. The ham came first, usually salt-cured and sliced thick, fried in a cast-iron skillet until crispy at the edges and fragrant with smokiness. And then came the trick: don't toss out the grease. That sizzling ham fat was the foundation of what made this dish legendary. Redeye gravy wasn't made with flour or milk. It was made with coffee. Strong, black, day-old coffee, poured directly into the hot skillet of ham drippings. The result? A thin, savory, slightly bitter gravy that looked like a dark eye staring back from the pan. Hence the name, Redeye Gravy. It was poured over the ham, spooned onto grits, or sopped up with a buttermilk biscuit that barely held together. No thickening agents. No fancy spices. Just bold salt, deep smoke, and the punch of bitter brew. In the taverns of Middletown, this dish was both hangover cure and working man's breakfast. Cheap to make, impossible to forget. But as diner culture rose and balanced breakfasts took over, redeye gravy faded from the plate. Today, it's rarely seen outside of old cookbooks or dusty southern diners. Yet its story deserves to be retold. Ham and redeye gravy is a reminder of a time when flavor didn't come from a bottle. It came from the bottom of a skillet and a pot of leftover coffee. Subscribe now because the next dish on our journey was once reserved for Sunday best, and we're bringing it back to your table. In the heart of Middletown's taverns, where the clatter of mugs met the hum of conversation, there was one dish that could silence a crowd with its aroma alone: ale-braised short ribs. This wasn't fast food. This was slow-cooked, soul-warming fare, crafted for the factory foreman, the traveling salesman, the middle-class father who needed real sustenance after a cold walk home. Short ribs weren't prized cuts back then. They were tough, fatty, and cheap. But in the hands of a patient tavern cook, they became something spectacular. First, the ribs were seasoned simply with salt and pepper, then seared until the bones browned and the fat crisped. This created the foundation, the flavor base, built right into the pan. Then came the ale. Not the fancy kind. Local, dark, and slightly bitter, poured straight into the skillet to deglaze all that richness. Add onions, garlic, carrots, a spoonful of mustard or molasses, maybe a bay leaf from the kitchen garden, and you had a braising liquid that was as bold as the men who ordered it. The ribs would simmer for hours, low and slow, until the meat surrendered to the bone and the sauce thickened into something you'd want to mop up with a hunk of bread or spoon over mashed potatoes. In Middletown Taverns, this dish wasn't served with fanfare. It came out steaming, fragrant, and humble, just like the people who ate it. But then, it disappeared. As refrigeration improved and meat became mass-produced, short ribs vanished from menus. They were too fatty, too slow to cook, too old-fashioned. Ale braising gave way to shortcuts and canned gravies. The dish was nearly forgotten. But today, it deserves a seat at the table once more. Ale-braised short ribs aren't just about meat. They're about patience, process, and pride. A recipe that says, we didn't have much, but we made it count. Subscribe now because the next dish we uncover comes from the sheep pens and turnip fields, and it just might change how you see mutton forever. Long before boneless cuts and marbled steaks filled our markets, Middletown's taverns simmered with the scent of a forgotten delicacy: mutton and turnip stew. A dish older than most recipes, yet once common at any working-class tavern table in early 1900s America. Mutton, yes, not lamb, but full-grown sheep, was considered meat for the practical. Tougher, gamier, and far more affordable, it was often the choice for families that needed protein without pretense. In the back kitchens of local taverns, cooks took what others overlooked and turned it into nourishment. Mutton cuts, typically neck, shoulder, or shank, were browned deeply in lard to develop flavor, then slowly simmered in water or weak broth. This stew wasn't about richness. It was about depth. Bay leaves, cracked peppercorns, onions, and maybe a splash of vinegar were added to tame the meat's bold flavor. And then, the turnips. These weren't side vegetables. They were the heart of the stew. Cheap, plentiful, and winter-hardy, turnips were peeled, chopped, and added during the final hour. As they softened, they absorbed the meat's richness and released their earthy bite into the broth. The stew simmered for hours, on wood stoves or iron ranges, until the mutton was tender enough to pull apart with a spoon. Served with dense rye bread or stone-ground cornmeal, it was the kind of meal that stuck with you all day long. But as lamb replaced mutton and turnips lost favor to potatoes, this stew faded into the footnotes of American food history. By mid-century, few even remembered its name, let alone its flavor. Yet in that forgotten bowl lies a story of thrift, survival, and flavor that defied expectations. Mutton and turnip stew was never about luxury. It was about using every part, wasting nothing, and feeding many with little. It sat in a jar behind the bar, pale and floating, like a dare in brine. To some, it was a delicacy. To others, a punishment. But in the taverns of 1900s Middletown, pickled tripe with crackers wasn't a joke. It was a tradition. Tripe, the stomach lining of a cow, was the kind of ingredient born from necessity. It was cheap, tough, and overlooked by those who could afford finer cuts. But in working-class taverns, it was treasured by those who knew how to turn scraps into something extraordinary. The process began with thorough cleaning. Tripe had to be boiled and rinsed, often multiple times, to remove its natural toughness and odor. Once tender, it was sliced into strips and soaked in a sharp vinegar brine, flavored with salt, peppercorns, bay leaves, mustard seeds, and sometimes red pepper flakes for kick. And then, it was left alone. Pickling wasn't just for flavor, it was for preservation. Refrigeration wasn't common in 1900s taverns, and a well-pickled jar of tripe could sit on a bar shelf for weeks. It was served cold, sliced thin, often straight from the jar, accompanied by saltine or soda crackers to temper the tang. Some dipped it in hot sauce. Others paired it with beer. But no one forgot the bite, chewy, acidic, bold. For immigrants, especially those from Italy, Germany, and Ireland, pickled tripe was a taste of home. For American-born patrons, it was often a rite of passage. But as food preferences modernized and organs fell out of fashion, tripe was quietly retired from menus. By the 1950s, it was almost gone, surviving only in specialty butcher shops and a few stubborn bars in the South and Northeast. Today, pickled tripe with crackers stands as a symbol of bold eating, of using every part, and of a tavern culture that valued flavor over flair. You might cringe. You might crave it. But you won't forget it. There was one smell that could silence a tavern and draw neighbors to the window: the thick, sweet scent of molasses baked ham slowly roasting in a cast-iron oven. In early 1900s Middletown, this dish wasn't an everyday meal. It was reserved for something special: paydays, holidays, or a visiting relative from the city. Yet in the taverns that dotted the town streets, this dish became a centerpiece, where working-class families tasted celebration without spending a fortune. The ham itself was salt-cured, often bone-in, and left to soak overnight to remove the excess brine. Once dried, it was rubbed with cloves, mustard powder, and black pepper. But the real signature, the reason this dish lingered in memory, was the glaze. Molasses, dark, sticky, and rich with burnt sugar notes, was mixed with a splash of cider vinegar and a spoonful of dry mustard. This glaze was brushed over the ham as it roasted, layer after layer, forming a caramelized crust that crackled when cut. The molasses didn't just sweeten, it preserved. And in homes without refrigerators, that mattered. It also elevated a humble cut of meat into something worthy of gathering. It was both practical and poetic. In Middletown taverns, the ham was often sliced thick and served with boiled potatoes, braised cabbage, or cornbread. Some patrons ate it hot. Others enjoyed it cold the next day between thick slices of bread. Either way, it symbolized abundance, even in lean times. But as sugar took new forms and molasses faded from American pantries, this dish slowly disappeared. Glazes became store-bought. Spiral hams arrived. And the slow, sticky ritual of molasses baking was pushed aside. Yet for those who remember, molasses-baked ham is more than a recipe. It's Sunday warmth. It's tavern comfort. It's American tradition glazed in time. In the clatter of Middletown taverns, before refrigeration was common and luxury seafood was a far-off dream, there was one dish that proved flavor didn't need fortune: codfish cakes with chow-chow relish. Salt cod was the hero of the working-class kitchen. Preserved in barrels and shipped from the Atlantic coast, it was cheap, lasted forever, and packed enough flavor to season an entire meal. For families watching every penny, it was a gift. For tavern cooks, it was a blank canvas. The cod, dry and salted, had to be soaked overnight to draw out the salt. Then it was flaked by hand and mixed with mashed potatoes, chopped onions, a dash of black pepper, and sometimes beaten egg. Shaped into small patties, they were pan-fried in lard or bacon fat until golden brown and crisp on the outside, soft and savory within. But what made these humble cakes unforgettable was the chow-chow relish. Bright, tangy, and full of crunch, chow-chow was a mix of chopped green tomatoes, cabbage, peppers, and onions, pickled in vinegar with mustard seed, turmeric, and a little sugar. Every tavern had its own twist. Some were spicy, some lean sweet, but all added a burst of life to the briny richness of codfish cakes. This dish was often served at breakfast with eggs, or as a hearty lunch for factory workers and street vendors alike. It filled the belly, stretched ingredients, and added color to otherwise gray days. But as canned tuna, fresh fillets, and frozen dinners entered the American kitchen, salt cod began to vanish. Chow-chow, too, faded, replaced by ketchup and mayonnaise. Today, both are nearly forgotten relics of frugal brilliance and bold taste. Codfish cakes with chow chow relish weren't about prestige. They were about making something incredible from what little you had, and doing it with pride. When the last plate was cleared, the mugs rinsed, and the fire reduced to embers, there was one dish that signaled the meal, and the day was done: buttermilk pie with nutmeg crust. In the taverns of 1900s Middletown, desserts weren't fancy, they were resourceful. No imported chocolate. No layered confections. Just a handful of pantry staples, turned into something magical. And buttermilk pie? It was the crown jewel of that simplicity. The filling was a revelation: tangy buttermilk, fresh eggs, a touch of flour, and sugar whisked with melted butter. Vanilla added warmth. Lemon zest added brightness. But it was the crust that turned heads, hand-rolled, flaky, and dusted with grated nutmeg, spicy, earthy, unforgettable. Baked until just set, the custard formed a golden top that cracked delicately with each bite. It was creamy, tart, sweet, and finished with a lingering warmth from that nutmeg crust. In many taverns, this was served in modest slices, often cold, sometimes with a spoonful of whipped cream or a few preserved berries on the side. But the real beauty? It kept for days, perfect for the tavern keeper to serve without waste. Buttermilk pie wasn't about indulgence. It was about comfort, a dessert that reminded every patron, factory worker, foreman, or traveler, that even modest ingredients could yield rich rewards. But as boxed desserts and refrigeration changed the landscape, this pie faded. Nutmeg was reserved for holidays. Buttermilk, once a staple, became a rarity. And this humble, beautiful dessert was shelved in favor of sugar-loaded trends. Yet today, when recreated with care, buttermilk pie with nutmeg crust whispers the flavors of a forgotten America, a final course that tastes like memory itself. And that brings our journey to a close. From pickled tripe to molasses ham, from oyster pies to turnip stew, we've unearthed the bold, the brave, and the beautifully forgotten recipes of Middletown Taverns. If you've loved this journey through America's lost kitchen, then don't just watch. Subscribe. Because in the next series, we're diving even deeper into immigrant recipes that shaped neighborhoods, families, and the nation's very soul. The past is rich. The flavor is real. And we're just getting started.